Welcome to this installment of Frank and Mary on Nantucket. I'm generally doing this with my co-host Arthur Bergeron, but he is away. So here we go. I'm doing it on my own. Arthur is an elder law attorney with Merrick O'Connell, which is a firm in Marlborough, Mass. He specializes in elder law and comes to Nantucket frequently. But this show is actually about Frank and Mary, who live with their three kids, Peter, Paul, and Mary Jr. Their goal is to live in their house till they die and be buried in the backyard. And so this show is about things specific to Nantucket that people who are, that you might want to know about living on Nantucket as you are aging. So today we have two guests. I'm really excited about them. First of all, we have Marguerite Davis, who has been coming to Nantucket as a summer person for over 20 years. Her husband was recently diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease about 5 years ago. And since then, she has become a lay observer of the science behind the disease. And she will be introducing another guest to the show. Marguerite?
So our story started in 2015, actually in Nantucket. It was during that summer when we'd be entertaining friends and, sitting around having lunch, and my husband would be telling stories, that we noticed he was having a lot of trouble with word retrieval, just coming up with words that he normally knew and details on stories he had told for years. So that really started what became our Alzheimer's journey. By the end of the summer, we both agreed that something really wasn't right and we wanted to get to the answer. So we got really lucky because we did three really crucial things and we did them right. The first thing that we did was we got a diagnosis. And I would tell everybody out there, if you think something is going on, don't let a doctor tell you that they can't diagnose Alzheimer's, because the imaging and the brain imaging and some of the other biomarker technology has gotten so much better in the last few years that they can diagnose it. My husband had something called an FDG PET scan. So we did that, we got the diagnosis. The second thing that we did right was we got it really early. And you want to know what's going on as soon as possible, because then that gives you the opportunity to do the third thing. And that is to get into a great drug trial. So we got into a great drug trial that helped him immensely. That was 5 years ago, and there are much better drug trials now. And that's really what I wanted to talk about today, was clinical trials for Alzheimer's. And I want to speak to two groups of people. There are the people who are already out there who are experiencing cognitive changes, and you're worried about it. And then there are other people who are out there who are worried about cognitive changes in the future. Maybe you had a parent or you had another close relative. You're like I am, you're getting to be about 60, your brain's slowing down a little bit, and you're worried about it for yourself. So for both of those groups of people, there are things that you can do in the clinical trial world. I want to introduce a very special guest, Dr. Donald Marks. Dr. Marks, and I'm going to read his official bio, and then I'll tell you a little bit about him. So Dr. Marks is a member of the medical staff at Beth Israel Lahey Hospital in Plymouth, and also the Nantucket Cottage Hospital. And until recently, he was the medical director for Plymouth, or the Division of Neurology at Beth Israel Plymouth. He's an assistant clinical professor of neurology at Tufts School of Medicine. For over 25 years, he's focused on the treatment of neurodegenerative diseases, specifically Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And he's a community neurologist. He sees patients with a variety of neurological disorders. And for many years, he's been involved in medical research. So for anybody who on Nantucket is interested in participating in a clinical trial, and I will tell you, my husband's just getting ready to start his third one, Dr. Marks is a person that you want to know. So let me give you Dr. Donald Marks.
Well, thanks for the introduction, Marguerite. It's been a pleasure taking care with you guys. It's always nice when people are engaged, bright, ask great questions. It makes it easier all the way around, and I really appreciate that. Yes, it's Alzheimer's is sort of the cancer of the 21st century. We now use the word. It's important to use the word. There's a great deal of confusion over the terminology. Dementia is simply a functional description. It means you're no longer capable of independent life because of cognitive deficit. You can have dementia due to many other causes other than Alzheimer's. And on the other end, you can have mild cognitive impairment or even no symptoms and yet still have Alzheimer's disease. It's sort of like coronary disease, where you may have asymptomatic crud in your coronary arteries, and for 40 years it doesn't do anything. Then you get angina, then you get a heart attack. The point being that to say it's normal aging to become forgetful is inaccurate most of the time. So when you start to have cognitive impairment, it usually is a signal that you have an underlying neurodegenerative disease. Now, it could be other things like alcoholism, depression with depressive pseudodementia, as we call it, medication effects, which are very common. People will sometimes take a lot of Tylenol PM, and the PM portion of it is Benadryl diphenhydramine. It can make you cognitively off. So a lot of what I do is get people off medicines they shouldn't be on that are making their cognition worse. The other point I want to make is that there's brain health independent of the disease. So there's a lot of things, whether it's exercise, whether it's cognitive stimulation, and so on, dietary changes, which probably have a significant impact on brain health and brain aging as an additive factor to the pathology of a disease like Alzheimer's. They do not necessarily have a direct effect on the disease itself. It's important to understand that. I think that that is not a reason to not do those other things, but it should not be confused with impacting the disease itself. Mm-hmm. Now, we still don't know exactly what Alzheimer's is. We know that there are certain proteins that increase and deposit in the brain as you have progressive symptoms of the disease. There's a huge debate about whether they're causative or associative. In other words, are they just markers of the tomb, like a tombstone is of a grave, or are they the cause of the reason the person's in the grave? So this has been used as the basis for treatment, where we make antibodies that get rid of the amyloid in the brain in an attempt to see if we can slow down the disease. And what happened over the last 15 years is that we started, as we often do in any drug experimentation with people who are sicker. It had no effect for people with moderate stage disease using these anti-amyloid monoclonal antibodies. In other words, they make a bunch of antibodies that are all targeted to the amyloid. And there was question about whether it was targeted to the right part of the amyloid, whether it's been given too early in the disease. So there's several studies that have been ongoing the last few years and increasing now to look at the drug in people with even milder disease, and most recently in people who have no symptoms but have a strong genetic risk for having the disease. And we can identify them with some of the markers that Marguerite was mentioning, whether it's looking at spinal fluid, looking at amyloid PET scans. So there are things you can do, even if you come from a family where there are several first-degree relatives, perhaps both parents, aunts, uncles, siblings who have the disease. It places you at high risk. And we now have something to offer that might hopefully keep the disease from ever becoming even MCI, let alone dementia. So that's the basis for why I was asked to speak, I guess. And I can certainly get more specific about the trials of some interest, literally as we're on here right now. The FDA advisory panel just released their preliminary written report to the FDA regarding aducanumab. This is the Biogen drug, where it was a complicated reason why it either worked or didn't. Most of this is public domain, has to be public domain. I can't speak about things that aren't. But it is worth it to mention a little bit about that because it's going to be in the news today. It'll be really in the news on Friday. If it weren't for the election, it would probably be the leading.
Yeah.
Wow. And so Dr. Marks, I think it's important for people who are watching this show to know that you come to Nantucket. I know a lot of people who have been involved with caring for someone with the disease and who know you, but do you get referrals from people's primary care physicians, or how do people who are concerned about or would like to get a diagnosis get in touch with you?
Sure. So, first of all, I come down on a Thursday and Friday once a month, year round. I've been doing it for 10 years now. And I take care of a fair number of people on the island who have been diagnosed with Alzheimer's or other related neurodegenerative diseases. And certainly if you call the outpatient clinic and ask to see me or go through your PCP, I've worked closely with all the primary care physicians over the years. We have a wonderful collegial relationship. And so really whatever way you would wish to would work, given those parameters. The one thing I do need to say, though, is that because of the island being the island, it's difficult if you want to be in a clinical trial. We started doing clinical trials in Plymouth because it was simply too difficult for people to go into Boston for repetitive infusions and other diagnostic studies. It just was, the traffic patterns were horrid. So we've been doing them in Plymouth for a long time, and we've had a couple of folks who came up from Nantucket to be involved. One person really wanted to be involved and was committed to coming off island as frequently as they needed to. Unfortunately, they screen failed, and that's a point we can talk about in a little bit, but there are a number of inclusion and exclusion criteria you need to meet in order to be in a trial. So even though you have an interest in it, you may or may not qualify for a given trial.
Okay. Marguerite, why don't you talk about your experience with trials and how it all works? Because I think that, that's something I'd like to know about.
Well, first of all, and I'm sure Dr. Marks, you're going to cringe when I say this, but I have noticed, I will tell you that I think that being in the clinical trial made a huge difference for my husband. And I'm my background's engineering, and I'm really kind of just really a nerd at heart. So I've really embraced this whole clinical trial thing. I had a neighbor whose husband was in a similar situation to my husband, and she also got her husband into the same trial that my husband was in, and we talk regularly. And during the time in which they were in this trial, their progression was very slow. And in other words, they were doing great while they were in the trial. So Dr. Marks will talk a little bit more about this trial. He brought it up a few minutes ago because it will be in the news. But the trial that's in the news right now, that's going to be in the news, is the one that my husband was on. That trial was stopped, and they are restarting it. So my husband is getting ready to go back into that trial and start redosing in the next probably 4 weeks. But while you're in the trial, it's a really interesting thing to do. You meet some very interesting people. The level of care that you get at no cost to you is phenomenal. One of the things that they learned, and Dr. Marks, correct me if I'm not saying this properly, my understanding is one of the things that they learned with these trials in the early 2000s is to screen and really invest a lot of resources in the screening for a trial. So to get into one of these trials, which potentially for some people can make a huge difference, to get into one of these trials, I'll be honest with you, it's not easy. It is a commitment in terms of time. You have to go and you have to do pass all these tests, and the reason they're doing all these tests is because it's a drug for Alzheimer's, and unless the drug company or whoever they are, unless they are sure that you have Alzheimer's, then they're not going to let you in that study. They're going to screen you for every other thing that could conceivably be causing the symptoms. And the last thing that they do, at least in the case of the trial that my husband was in, was a very expensive beta amyloid PET scan to confirm that you actually do have this pathology in your brain. And it's not unusual for people to go through 6 weeks, 8 weeks of screening and then get to the point where they get this brain scan and it comes back and they say, yeah, you don't have this pathology in your brain. I'm sorry, you can't get in the trial. At which point you can run away and jump up and down and go, woohoo, I don't have the pathology in my brain. But the level of screening that you go through and the level of care that you get at no cost to you is pretty phenomenal. We originally got into the trial in Miami, and then in the summertime, we would transfer up to Dr. Marks. So once a month, we would go to the ferry, get on the fast ferry, get a rental car on the other side, drive about an hour to Dr. Mark's office, and we did that for a couple of years. You know, when you live on Nantucket, it's a little bit of a pain, but it's not bad, honestly. It really isn't bad. And I would encourage anyone to do it. I will tell you that the trial manager, who shall remain nameless because I don't want to get him in trouble, at the site where we started doing this trial in Miami. So it's a fairly big site, and they had a number of people, more than 20 people in this particular trial. The trial manager told me that during the phase 1B and the phase 3, meaning a longer time horizon on this drug, he said he had 5 patients who were cognitively stable during the time they were taking this drug. Or I should say that, during the time they were in the trial. He doesn't know if they were getting active drug or not. But there were 5 people who had no cognitive changes or declines over a period of years during the time at which they were in that trial. So I think something like that's huge. And that would be the reason that I would encourage people to get into the trial. 1, you're helping the science, and 2, you or your loved one could be tremendously helped by a potential drug.
And so, Dr. Marks, tell us what happens. So you go through the testing and you are admitted to a trial. Are there placebos? Does everyone get the dose? Is it done intravenously, or does it make any difference? You know, walk us through, if you are admitted to a trial, what happens to you?
Sure. The trials themselves are pretty straightforward. It depends on the drug under investigation, but they're typically intravenous infusions that last an hour or so, that occur monthly. Some of these drugs that are being looked at are every other week, but mostly monthly. The infusion after it's given is, at the beginning, people are asked to wait a bit to make sure there's no allergic reaction. They can occur. They're pretty uncommon. The infusions themselves are not like cancer chemotherapy, for example, where you get sick from the infusion itself. It's basically just an antibody in saline. The IV itself is a pretty innocuous procedure. Now, throughout the trial, you're going to get blood tests done at various times, EKGs, psychologic testing to see what the effect or not is of the drug. You're going to get periodic MRI scans in some drugs more than in others because of a thing called ARIA, where you can get this temporary small points of bleeding or swelling of certain areas of the brain. It sounds horrible, but actually 60–70% of the time it's completely asymptomatic. Probably means the drug is working and the blood vessels get a little leaky from the amyloid being removed for a short period of time. Sort of like if you were on chemo and it affected the growth of the gut lining cells, that you might get diarrhea. It doesn't mean that the drug's hurting you. It just means that it's a known side effect based on its mechanism of action. That's actually a big deal in terms of whether the drug we were referring to a little while ago gets approved, because it needs to have a lot of MRI monitoring, and just the infrastructure to be able to administer these drugs and monitor them safely is itself a whole issue. It's an economic and political issue as well as a medical issue. Now, as to the issue of placebo, the only way you can really tell whether drugs work of this type is to do a true double-blind placebo-controlled trial, which means I don't know what I'm giving you and you don't know what you're receiving. Now, somebody does, the pharmacist who mixes the drug does, but that's kept blinded from those of us taking care of someone and the patient and their family themselves. So typically the double-blind period exists for 1.5 to 2 years, depending on the study, and then people are allowed to go into an open-label extension, which means that everybody who is on active drug continues on active drug, and everybody who is on placebo gets to be on placebo. That way, we go through the scientific merit of having a double-blind placebo-controlled trial to see if the drug is different from placebo, but also deal with the ethical reality of not keeping people on placebo endlessly.
Great, great. I was curious about that.
So real quickly, because I looked at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Dr. Marks, because you can get into so much of this. Can you talk a little bit about the AHEAD 3-4-5 trial? Because this is a big deal in the industry, or what's happening with this particular trial.
So the AHEAD 3-4-5 trial is based on, it's an extension of what was the A4 trial, which will not read out until a year from now, 2 years from now. But basically the idea is that if you give the medicine to people earlier in the disease process, that the effect size in slowing down or preventing progression will be greater than if you wait until later. So what they're trying to do, based on all of the information we've learned from these previous trials, and realize even a failed trial gives us tremendous information about what to do or not do next. So what we're going to be doing is identifying people from the age of 55 to 80 who have genetic markers. There's a thing called apolipoprotein E4, or family histories, or positive findings of amyloid protein in spinal fluid testing, or an amyloid PET scan, which is positive. We're going to find people who are screened for those, who are at risk for developing Alzheimer's symptoms, but so far have no symptoms. They're called preclinical. And there's two parts to it. There's A3 and A4-5. And what it has to do with is the measurement of the amount of amyloid in the brain in the amyloid PET scan. So you have people who have a significantly increase from normal range, even though they have no symptoms, who are going to be placed on medication every 2 weeks for a few months and then go to every month. It's called induction, trying to get rid of the stuff that's already there. And then you have another group who are above normal, but not as much above normal. And those people will go on monthly infusions. And the idea, again, is to see, it's a 4-year trial, to see if there is this is a difficult one because you could be on placebo for 4 years. But the point is to see if there is a difference between people treated and those not treated in terms of whether they ever develop symptoms of cognitive impairment as related to Alzheimer's disease. We're very excited to be doing this. It's being run through the University of Southern California as sort of the guiding institution, but it's called the ATRI, which is a consortium of several dozen academic centers and a few private centers like our own who are doing this. We're about to get started with it. COVID-19 put a damper. We were ready to go in early summer, but there were issues because of COVID-19 and the ability to do infusions and to get the scans and so on. But there's also another study we'll be undergoing. It's an observational study, meaning no medication, called TRECPAD. And for people who are 50 to 55 or don't want to be in a drug infusion trial, or have some other reason they don't want to be in one of these drug treatment trials, it will allow us to identify people who are similarly at risk as we're doing for AHEAD, keep them in a registry, and as new trials come about, it would be a way of dealing with that. It also would include snowbirds, because the AHEAD trial does not allow snowbirds, such as Marguerite and her husband have been doing. And so for those folks, it might be another way of getting involved as well. So that's the quick and skinny on those.
So basically, if I put it in a nutshell, the AHEAD 3-4-5 trial is taking the idea that this pathology, which takes 10 to 20 years to accumulate in your brain, that if you can go and effectively remove it from the brain before anybody ever has symptoms, then you can cure Alzheimer's by preventing it.
It's called secondary prevention, because if you had primary genetic reasons to have it, this is not changing that, but it's changing the effect of the gene. Yes, it is a secondary prevention trial. We don't know if it'll work. It may or may not. The other, just to the point you made earlier, Marguerite, usually we did not know who was on active or placebo But if people had the brain inflammation, that doesn't typically occur on placebo. So some people were effectively unblinded. And I can't speak to that in more detail or specifically, but the very quickly, because it's going to be in the news, I think it's really important that people understand what this is about. Aducanumab was 2 trials. There was a trial in Europe called Emerge, and the one in the US was called Engage. The one in the US started sooner. In the early days, we were afraid of giving a higher dose to people who had ApoE4 as their genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's. Not everybody who has ApoE4 gets it. Not everybody who doesn't have it doesn't get it. But anyway, they allowed for the higher dose in the American trial only at the end. So only a handful of people were in that trial actually got the high dose. Many more people in Europe got the high dose in that trial. That trial definitely showed positive results. It's up before the European Union for approval. I don't know what their rules are about 2 trials. The FDA requires 2 trials. But they halted the trial. That was the one your husband was in, Marguerite. And the problem was that after they looked at the data again, they realized that in those few people in that American trial who had reached the higher dose, that they looked the same as the people who had been in the European trial. So that's what's up before the FDA. I literally was looking at the first posting of this, which just came out in the last hour, I believe.
Really?
Before coming on TV. It's out there if you want to read it. It's public domain. And basically, I haven't gotten through it enough to tell you, but either it means that it's likely to be approved or not. The FDA generally goes with what the advisory committee says, but not always, because there's a huge pressure to do something. But you also don't want to approve a drug prematurely, and you want to make sure that it does what it says it's going to do. So that's what's going on with aducanumab.
I mean, it seems so interesting that we're talking about trials and drug solutions with the whole COVID business going on, and seeing how the rush to, how long, people have been working on trials for some time, and yet there has been no real solution to or cure for Alzheimer's. So what would a cure look like if one of these, when a trial is finally over and it's been successful, what then happens?
Well, I think a cure would be, and frankly, one of the problems about approving a drug, everybody will want to be on it, and then what do you do for the further trials? That's a real issue, which no one's really dealt with well. I brought it up. The American Academy of Neurology may have to deal with it in general with neurodegenerative diseases. It's a problem. How would it be if the first drug for cancer that increased lifespan by 8 months, and everybody wanted to be on it, and they weren't willing to be in another one, and ultimately another drug was found that worked for 3 years. It's a real problem. It's an ethical and political issue. But I think that a cure, we're presuming that it's going to be simple enough that getting rid of the amyloid or getting rid of the tau protein, that's another strategy. It may be that what matters more is how early you get it, and that all you do is prolong it so that if you start treating at the age of 60, that maybe you never accumulate the burden ever in your life enough to generate the disease. Or maybe you get it when you're 95, at which point maybe it's less of a concern. So delay, as we do with cancer chemotherapy, may be commensurate with cure. Same thing with AIDS, HIV. We don't cure it by and large.
Right.
We make it a non-lethal disease. So the concept of cure depends on how you define cure.
Wow. And so, Marguerite, you mentioned one time about, you likened being treated for Alzheimer's and being treated for a heart disease. Can you remember what you told me about that?
I've heard some researchers and some speakers say that the hope for Alzheimer's is that it becomes like heart disease and cholesterol. So cholesterol is essentially a biomarker for heart disease. If you have high cholesterol, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get a heart attack, for example, but it means that you're at risk for it. And the association is strong enough that if they then medicate you, if you take a statin, and so many people are on statins, then your chance of having a heart attack is so much less. So the hope for Alzheimer's is that through the use of biomarkers, and specifically they're looking at these proteins in the brain, the beta amyloid protein that Dr. Marks has mentioned, and he just mentioned another one, the tau protein, that through something like a blood test, and they have these blood tests already, the drug companies are, my understanding, driving a lot of the development of the biomarkers because they don't want to have to pay for a $4,000 brain scan for people getting in their trials when they could effectively pay $400, say, for a blood test, or for another technology that's being investigated now is a retinal scan. So the hope for the future that I've heard is that maybe at age 50, 55, 60, that you would have some type of a screening test, like a cholesterol test, blood test, or a retinal scan. Then your doctor would say, you know, it looks like you're accumulating some of these proteins in your brain, and based on your current health picture, I recommend that you take this medication. Now, that medication could be, ideally it would be a pill, but right now that's a little complicated. Dr. Marks and I talked about this the other day, but he did say that there are some other, like maybe it's something akin to like a flu shot or a vaccine, or there are, right now the drugs that they're having success with are IV infusions, and that is a little bit complicated for the general population and for the cost associated with that. However, just because one drug is the first one that he talked about, like with cancer being successful, that doesn't mean that there aren't going to be multiple generations of drugs behind that. I don't know what the first statin was that was ever approved, but I imagine nobody's using that one any longer. So kind of a long answer, but that's the hope, is that eventually no one ever gets Alzheimer's because they know that you're getting this stuff in your brain, and they have effective treatments to get it out of your brain before you ever develop the Alzheimer's.
Wow, that is so, that stuck with me when you told me that before, because that is the best we can hope for in something that is a disease like Alzheimer's. I want to thank you both very much. This is a subject that I'm extremely interested in, and I've signed up for a trial. I haven't gone, I need to take another step because I think that I would love to be involved in one. But again, thank you both for joining us on the Frank and Mary on Nantucket show. We look forward to seeing you next time with a different topic, and hopefully Arthur will be around. So thanks again for watching.